This week on Bourbon Moth Woodworking, I'm gonna make this bench.
Hey. I said I'd make the bench for you. I didn't say you could take over the entire video. That's my thing. This week on Bourbon Moth Woodworking, I'm gonna show you how I made this octagonal bench for some no-name celebrity. So, follow along, see how I did it. Hello?
Mr. Hibbs, it's Mr. Patrick Harris. How are you?
Patrick Harris. Sorry, man, I don't know any Patrick Harris. Wrong number. Hello?
Jason, it's Neil Patrick Harris. How's it going?
Who?
Neil Patrick Harris. I'm an actor. I've been on your podcast.
Oh, yeah, the kid doctor guy, right?
Yeah, I love that reference. I have an opportunity for you, and I thought it might be cool. I'm trying to make a bench, an outside bench, and there's some specifics. Is that something that you might theoretically be interested in?
Who is this again?
Oh my god, it's Neil Patrick Harris. I'm on Instagram as well. My husband and I are celebrating our 17th wedding anniversary, and the year is for 17 is furniture, and so I thought it might be cool to make an octagonal bench that goes around a tree, and it seems like you're like the perfect guy to make some cool custom piece. What do you say?
Where do you live again?
I live in New York, in upstate New York.
Ah, man, I don't really do work out of state. It's a long ways away. I got trees and wood and stuff.
I can pay you in bourbon.
Yeah, man. What are we building? Because Neil lives on the opposite side of the country from me, I needed to find a wood shop on the East Coast where I could build this bench as well as get some much needed help. So I called my good friend Keith Johnson of Keith Johnson Woodworks. He's an amazing woodworker and even a more amazing friend. Keith was able to procure a forest's worth of sapele lumber for us to build the bench out of. Sapele is great for outdoor furniture because it's hard, rot resistant, bug resistant, and you don't even have to finish it. You just set it outside and let nature naturally gray it, kind of like Neil Patrick Harris's hair. Anyways, with Keith on board, we got to work, first moving all of our lumber out of the way so that we could start breaking it down into our individual parts. Now, the design for this bench is an octagon that will wrap around the base of a tree. So unlike a traditional piece of furniture where each piece you have to make once or twice, for this project we have to make each piece 8 times. So we started breaking down the lumber and labeling each piece carefully. Then, once we got our 8 individual pieces, I taped them all together in stacks and labeled the stack. The last thing we want to do is get things mixed up. That would just make our life that much harder. And that's pretty much how we spent our first day. Rough cutting pieces, labeling them, and, well, rough cutting some more. We did this for multiple reasons. 1, just to ensure we had enough lumber to build the entire bench, and 2, it freed up some much needed space inside Keith's shop. With all of our pieces cut down roughly to size, I took this plywood template that we made for the shape of the back leg, and I started tracing it onto our 8-quarter sapele stock. Once I had all the legs traced out, I took them over to Keith's bandsaw, and I started roughly cutting them out, making sure to leave a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch outside my pencil line. We'll clean this all up over on the router table here in just a little bit. Speaking of the router table, as I was busy cutting out the legs on the bandsaw, Keith was busy inventing this genius router table sled, This would allow us to hold each rough cut piece firmly in place with the template as a guide and run it through the router table. So Keith chalked up a nice, beefy, spiral down cut bit with a top mounted bearing, and we just started going to town on these legs. Nice and slow. First we do one side, and then once that side was all cut, all we had to do was pop the piece out, move it over to the other side, re-clamp it down, reposition our clamps for the template, and run it through on the other side. Keith is an absolute master when it comes to jigs like this. It's just in his blood. So we just started routing until we had all of our legs nicely cut out and looking pretty smooth. I don't often work with other people on projects, but I gotta tell you, it was pretty darn nice. I mean, I basically just stood around and let Keith do all the work while I napped. I'm just kidding. We traded off back and forth, cutting out the legs, and in no time we had all 8 legs cut and ready to go. Next, it was time to start milling down some lumber to make our frame assemblies. These frames would hold each leg to one another and hopefully create a perfect octagon. So we ran a bunch of wood through the joiner, and then we cut it to size over on the table saw. And then of course there was more chopping of each piece down to its appropriate size and labeling them accordingly. Keith got crazy. He started just doing 2 pieces at once. He is a madman. And as he would cut them, I would label them. FL stands for front leg, in case you were wondering. And pretty soon we had all of our individual pieces cut for our legs and our frame assembly. We were getting along great, and the project was moving just swimmingly. The next thing we had to do was create some sort of jig template thing that we could use to work on the joinery for all of our leg pieces. So we took another plywood template that was the exact shape of our leg, and we drilled a bunch of holes in it. Then we took some more plywood pieces and we used double-sided tape to adhere them to that plywood template. Then, screwing through the holes, we attached those separate pieces directly to Keith's outfeed table, making this beautiful jig here. We had some plywood guides for our domino joiner and the shape of our leg on the inside. This allowed us to clip our back leg on this side here, then clip our front leg on this side here. Then we could hit the domino joiner from both sides, ensuring that all of our mortises were drilled out in the exact right location. Then we could plop in our cross braces for our front and back leg and do the same thing. Hit them with the domino joiner on both sides, making sure that everything would be lined up nice and perfectly. At least that's the goal, right? So with our jig all figured out, me and Keith got to work mortising out all of our pieces. Keith would do one side, then hop the domino joiner over to me, and I would do the other side. We'd drill first with the domino joiner flat to the outfeed table, then plop a piece of 3/8 inch plywood to raise it up and drill again, giving us 2 perfectly mortised out holes for 2 sets of dominoes side by side. And in no time, all of our leg pieces were drilled out and ready to hook together. Before we glued anything up, however, we dry assembled each leg piece just to make sure that everything fit together perfectly and was uniformly the same size across the board, as you can see in this wonderfully edited little montage of us putting all 8 leg pieces together. You know, when you think about it, this is basically just a chair in itself. Not too bad. What would you like for Christmas, little boy? So with all of our leg pieces dry assembled, it was time to start gluing them up for real. For this, we used Total Boat's Thick Sew. This is a 2-part epoxy that magically mixes itself right in the tip. It's also nice because it's thick, so it doesn't run all over the place. We decided to go with epoxy for our joinery because this was going to be an outside piece of furniture, and well, epoxy apparently does great for outside furniture. So with our holes filled with epoxy, That didn't sound right. Me and Keith started plopping each individual leg assembly together. Man, it is so refreshing to be able to work with someone else in the shop. Glue-ups are just a breeze. We'd glue, we'd clamp, we'd ensure that each part was square, and, well, we'd do the entire process over again. 8 times in total until we had all of our legs nicely clamped together. Now all we had to do was wait for our glue to dry. While we waited for our glue to dry, we started cutting all of our pieces for our frame assembly. Now, each leg is going to be held to one another with an internal frame. This is going to tie everything together, making our octagon, and allow us to take the whole thing apart to get it around the tree. So after cutting each piece, Keith started marking them out for our dominoes. And this is where we got a little crazy. Just like our leg assembly, we wanted to stack 2 dominoes, one on top of each other in each joint. So Keith was going to use the smaller domino joiner, and I would use the larger one. He would drill out a hole at the top of each joint with the small 500 domino joiner, and when he was done, he would hand the piece to me, and I would drill out the secondary hole lower down using the larger domino joiner and our fancy little plywood clamping jig, which worked amazing, by the way. We should really market these things because, I mean, it's basically like a Craig jig for the domino joiner. But hey, if it works, it works. So once again, enjoying the benefits of working with someone else to share the load, we just started working our way through all of the frame assembly pieces. There was 8 frames in total. Each frame consisted of 5 separate pieces, so you'd think this would take a while, but we had each one mortised out in no time and started dry assembling them together. Once again, just to double check and make sure everything fit the way it was supposed to and all of our seams lined up correctly. Because none of our frame pieces were square, I knew clamping was going to be a trick, so I made some clamping cauls to glue on the outside of each piece, as well as these interior cauls that would allow us to clamp everything together, ensuring that it all stayed nice and flush. So with our clamping somewhat figured out, it was back to our Total Boat thickened epoxy to glue everything up. We tried our best not to get any epoxy on the 12 cats that randomly frequent Keith's shop from time to time. I keep telling him not to leave the garage door open, but tell you what, he just doesn't listen. So again, working together as the dream team that we had become, we started hooking all of our frame pieces together. We would fill each hole with epoxy, get them roughly in place, put some clamps on the top, some clamps on the bottom to push in our side pieces, and some clamps with these interior clamping cauls to bring those side pieces out flush with our top and bottom brace pieces. If you're confused, I mean, join the club. So am I. With glue ups like this, you just try and get enough clamps on there to make sure everything's got adequate pressure and do what works. By the next morning, our epoxy was dry, so I started stripping the clamps and popping off our cauls. I just glued the cauls on with a little CA glue sandwiched between some green tape, because Keith loves his green tape. And with our lower frames done, it was time to start working on the frames for our back supports. These were a little bit trickier. Because the back slanted at 10 degrees in towards the tree, we had a lot more angles to deal with. Our side pieces were cut at 22.5 degrees, and our top and bottom pieces were cut at 10 degrees. So before we actually started hooking our frame pieces together for the backs, we decided we should roughly put our entire octagon assembly together just to make sure that we were correct with our angles and such. Now eventually this will all be held together with carriage bolts, but in the meantime we just decided to use clamps. Now we were thoughtful about our process in building this whole thing. You see, it's an octagon, which means it's 8-sided, which means you take off at one point, make 8 right-handed turns, and hopefully end up at the same point. but we were a little unsure on whether or not our math would compute. So when we put the whole thing together, we purposely did not build our 8th section. We left that one open. We figured we would custom make that one at the very end after we ensured that it would fit properly.
Oh,
So with 7 of our 8 sides done, we took measurements on our last piece and we handmade everything, but we custom fit our last frame piece to size. You know, we were only off an 1/8 of an inch, which isn't bad considering that means we were only off about a 1/64 of an inch on each section up to that point. Not too bad in my book. So we made our last piece an 1/8 of an inch bigger, and it slid in absolutely perfectly. With that, our entire lower structure of the Octagon bench was done, and we were ready to start working on the frames for our seat backs. So we started by making one frame piece, cut all of our pieces to size, and I just hooked them together with a little CA glue, just to test and see if they fit. Once we knew that it would fit properly, well, then we could make all the other frames the exact same size. So Keith took a mallet and busted apart all my hard work, and we used each individual piece as a template to cut out our remaining 8 seat frame parts. I would label them, hand them to Keith, and he would cut them to size. We were an unstoppable piece cutting machine, if I do say so myself, and this is my voiceover so I can say whatever the flip I want. With all of our pieces cut, we started laying them out and marking them for our dominoes. Once again, I had to make some fancy calls to ensure that we could clamp everything together because the sides were angled and the entire thing tapered from top to bottom. It was a trick, but we got it done and started sending in our dominoes. Just one set on the back because this was a lot thinner. Ew, gross, man. Ugh, people are watching. In no time, we had all 8 of our frame pieces dry fit and ready to glue up. Unfortunately, we ran out of our beloved thickened epoxy, so for gluing up our frame pieces, we had to switch to just plain Jane Total Boat 2-part epoxy. It worked just as good, it's just a bit more runny, so obviously we're going to have a little more cleanup after our glue dries, epoxy dries, whatever this stuff is called. With all of our joints glued, I plopped on my fancy clamping cauls and we put everything in clamps. And we just kept doing this back and forth until we had all 8 of our frame pieces glued up. Next thing we had to do was figure out our upper octagonal shelf thingamabob. This is kind of the cap for the entire bench that will sit on top of our leg assembly pieces and hug the tree, if you will. We needed to figure out a way that we could hook this together without fully hooking it together, because obviously if it was fully hooked together, we weren't going to be able to get it around the tree when we went to deliver the piece. So Keith sent some dominoes in on each side of our pieces, and then he used this fancy lamello plate joiner thingamabob. I'd never seen one of these before, but it's kind of like a biscuit joiner on steroids. You mortise out a slot for a fancy plastic clip, you drill a hole in the bottom of the piece that you can get an Allen key into, then you slide in a clip on one side, add your dominoes that are going to hook the whole joint together, and you slide in a clip on the other side. Then all you have to do is push your seam together using those dominoes for alignment and insert an Allen key into our pre-drilled hole. This engages a little clip inside that mortised out hole thing, and it tightens the entire joint together. This would allow us not only to take it apart when we assemble it, but it will also allow us to glue up each half without the use of any clamps. Pretty genius if you ask me. So I measured out a little more Total Boat epoxy, and then I spent some time milking Keith. That's awkward. Then we glued up 2 halves of the octagon shelf. I'd insert some epoxy, insert the clips, insert the dominoes, and tighten everything down, making sure not to glue up our final seams because that's what we would use to, well, take it apart and hopefully slide it smoothly around our tree. So as you can see here, we have our two halves glued up. We put our last halves together without epoxy and we tighten it down, creating a perfectly made octagonal shelf thingy-mabob. But hold on, ladies and gentlemen, we're not finished yet. The next day, after the epoxy was dry, Keith took the entire piece over to a friend of his, Mike, at Veteran Wood Co. He's got this crazy cutting robot thing. I think they call it a CNC, if I'm not mistaken. Using the CNC, he carved out the Roman numerals for 17 in 4 of our 8 sides, because this was a present for Neil's 17th wedding anniversary. Then after carving out all of the Roman numerals, he again used his magic robot to cut out a perfect circle on the interior of the octagon. This would just make a cleaner transition from bench to tree. At least that was our plan. So while Keith was busy just standing around watching a robot do all his work for him, I stayed home and actually got some real work done. Now that our entire assembly was done for all of the framework for our bench, we needed to start making it look like a finished piece. So I slowly and meticulously took apart our entire bench and labeled each piece so we could get it back together the way we originally had it assembled. With each piece labeled, I took them one by one out to Keith's shop and slowly started sanding them down until they were perfectly smooth. Kind of like Keith's unshaven face. Next, I got a trim router with a 1/4-inch roundover bit and I added a nice rounded profile to all of our pieces, just to soften them up a bit and make sure that nobody got any splinters in their fingers or bums as they sat upon the bench. Then I took a little epoxy and I sealed all the exposed end grain on every single one of our pieces. Sapile does great outdoors without any finish, but if there was ever going to be any problems, it'd be on that end grain, so we didn't want to take any chances. By the time I was finished with all my hard work, Keith finally got home from the robot store and decided to lend a helping hand. We began cutting down all of our seat slats to size. Now our back seat slats were a little complicated. They had to be cut at a 22.5-degree angle on one side, as well as tapered from top to bottom to match the profile of our leg assemblies. So Keith used this fancy L jig on his table saw that allowed him to cut a taper and a 22.5-degree angle all at the same time. Pretty flippin' sweet. While he was busy doing that, I took the roboted top octagon that he brought home and I started cleaning it up a bit. There's a few things that not even a robot can do. Actually, that's not true. In hindsight, that robot could have flippin' totally done this. I don't know why he made me do it all by hand. Anyways, I softened each corner, adding just a slight rounded profile with a little plywood template, and once again I used a 1/4-inch roundover bit on every side just to soften it up and make it look pretty. I mean, not quite as pretty as I look, perfectly framed inside of it, but anyways. After I finished on the top, I took all the pieces that Keith had been working on the table saw and I added a roundover to them as well. Then we sanded everything. First with the power sander, then by hand. And yeah, somehow I got stuck with the by hand part. Thanks a lot, Keith. Then with all of our pieces sanded and rounded over, it was back into Keith's dining room to put it all back together. Again. There's going to be a lot of taking down and putting back up in this video. It's just part of the process. And then we set that beautiful crown in place. Now all of our leg and seat frame assembly will be held together with carriage bolts. This is to allow the wood to be held firmly together but still move a little bit as it expands and contracts outdoors. So we very carefully marked where all of our bolts needed to go on the top of each piece. Then we disassembled the entire thing again and marked where we needed to drill out our holes for the bolts to pass perfectly through frame, leg, and back into frame. It's times like this that I was very glad not to be doing this entire project alone. Keith is a true blue friend, and I am grateful for him. With all of our frame and seat pieces marked out, we took them one by one into Keith's shop and we drilled them out on the drill press. Then we carried them back into Keith's dining room, and you guessed it, we reassembled the entire thing. Again, this time with bolts instead of clamps. This will be our final method for joining the entire structure of the bench. With our bench frame all bolted together, it was finally time to start getting some slats in place. Now all of our seat slats are pretty much just cut to length, no big deal, with the exception of the last slat that needs to be cut to fit around each leg assembly. So Keith cut those pieces to size over on the bandsaw, and then he rounded over each individual seat slat after first pre-drilling them with a countersink bit where we would place our screws. Then we clamped each section in place and pre-drilled through the seat slat and into our actual bench frame. I came quickly behind and inserted our stainless steel fasteners. It's very important when building any outside piece of furniture to choose your fasteners wisely. Stainless steel is a great option because it won't rust or break down with the weather leaching out and staining your piece. Nobody wants a leached out, stained piece of outside furniture, especially not Neil Patrick Harris. Once we had one section in place and firmly secured down, we just started working off that section and slowly making our way around the entire bench. We'd lay our slats, I'd mark out where each slat needed to be pre-drilled for our fasteners, and we'd move on to the next one. Once we got all of our slats in place, all we needed to do was pop them off, pre-drill with our countersink bit, put them back on, pre-drill, and insert our fasteners. Man, I said all we have to do, but when you really say it out loud, it sounds like a lot of work. And let me tell you, it was a lot of work. Meticulous, repetitive, overwhelming at times. But I had Keith by my side, and things were going smoothly. And yes, in case you were wondering, when we got to the final screw on our seat slats, we inserted it together. Like true friends, hand in hand. Friends that had gone into battle together. Friends that had sweat together. Friends that would do anything for each other. Yet somehow I wound up in the middle of the bench, trapped like a rat in a cage. Anyways, with all of our seat slats installed, it was time to start screwing our frame pieces in between each one of our leg assembly pieces. So we pre-drilled with a countersink bit, and we inserted 4 stainless steel screws, 2 in the top and 2 in the bottom. Once all of our frame pieces were installed, we pre-drilled holes through the top of each one of the frame pieces that we would eventually use to attach our top robot, octagon, circle, tree hugger thing. And then finally, it was time to attach our back seat slats. These were a little tricky because, like I mentioned before, they had some angles going on. The 2 outer pieces had to be tapered, and the 2 inner pieces, well, they were just rectangles. We actually got pretty darn quick at this process. Keith would plop the slats in place, space them out, while I put some clamps on and pre-drilled. Then he would come along and pre-drill the remaining holes, and I would sink in the fastener. See, that was so fast I couldn't even do the whole voiceover while you were watching. We were like an unstoppable slat drilling machine. At one point, I didn't even know if those were my hands or his hands. We were working so in tandem, racing for our goal of a completed bench. And just like that, our last section was installed, and there was only one thing left to do. and that was plop on our robot top. That's what I'm affectionately calling our octagon shelf crown thing. So I climbed inside the bench, and using those pre-drilled holes through each one of our frame assemblies, we sent some more fasteners up into the top. We thought about coming from the top down into the frame, but we just didn't think it'd look as clean. And what do you know? Our bench was complete. Now all we had to do was take it back apart and go hook it around Neil's tree. So we removed the screws on 2 sections of our frame assembly, one on the right side and one on the left side.
Here's Johnny.
Then after removing the bolts in those 2 sections, all I had to do was push, and the whole thing popped apart. Now we had 2 half-circle benches with some connecting sections to tie it all together. Now all we had to do was drive the whole thing out to Long Island and wrap it seamlessly around Neil Patrick Harris's tree. I guess it really is true what they say, there is a first time for everything. So with our rented U-Haul van all loaded up, we went to sleep and were ready for a delivery early next morning. It was a 3-hour drive from Keith's shop to Neil's house in the Hamptons, which I wouldn't have minded so much, but Keith wanted to play the license plate game the entire way out there, and we didn't see anything except Jersey and New York license plates. So it was pretty uneventful. We did have to do a little bit of surgery on the tree to get the bench to fit. There happened to be this root right in the way, so I just cut it out. I mean, I don't think the tree needed it. Just don't tell Neil. By this point, we had taken this thing apart and put it back together so many times in Keith's dining room that installing it on site was second nature. We just slid our 2 half circles into place and plopped in our connecting seat sections. Once our seat sections were bolted in place, we added our octagonal shelf tree-hugging top thing. This time hooking it together with a little epoxy in between each joint and tightening it down with Keith's magic lamello clamp system thingamabob. Then Keith was very nice and made me reach in the tight space between the tree and the back of the bench to sink all of our screws up through the frame assembly and attach our top. Next, all we needed to do was attach each one of our back seat frames where it originally was supposed to go. This was super easy because it was already all pre-drilled, so all we had to do was plop it in place and reinsert our screws. I did one side and Keith did the other, and we were both in our separate corners. Finally, some alone time. Then all that was left to do was to reattach our back seat slats, and this project was complete. Now I know what you're thinking. How long is it going to be before that tree outgrows that hole and breaks this entire bench apart? Well, rest assured, we actually consulted with an arborist on this project, and this sugar maple should only grow about 1 inch in diameter every 100 years. So we've got a good 200 years before this tree ever touches the bench, and I'm okay with that.
Oh my gosh, that is so cool! It is so beautiful. Well
This
done.
is so good.
So
Happy
awesome.
anniversary.
It's so good.
It's so beautiful. Better than my West Down rocking things I got. Baby, let the rhythm take control. Let the rhythm move you. Sweat.
I can honestly, legitimately say that before this bench, this felt like a space that had potential, but you didn't really couldn't really hang out. You look at the bird feeders through the window of the kitchen.
Right.
But now this feels like an actual room. Like with the use of this bench now, you want to come out here and read the paper or like just sit and chill. This is
Meditate.
fantastic.
I'd like to give a huge thanks to Neil Patrick Harris for his trust in us to make this project a reality. He is truly one of the nicest, most generous people I have ever had the pleasure of working for. And also a huge thanks to Keith Johnson. Without him, this project would not have been possible. He's making his own video on this build, so if you'd like a second opinion on this story, make sure to check out the video on his page, and don't forget to subscribe.